The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse overlooking Lower Manhattan. From the 40th floor, the city looked like a constellation of blurred lights, each droplet on the glass distorting the world below into something unrecognizable. Elena Marino stood barefoot on the cold marble floor, her silk robe barely warming her against the chill that seemed to seep from within rather than from the November air outside. She'd stopped counting the days. Time had a way of blurring when your life wasn't really yours. The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Italian leather furniture, original Basquiat paintings on the walls, a kitchen with appliances she'd never learned to use because Victor insisted on having a private chef. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. Everything was his. Victor Leone. Even his name carried weight in the underworld of New York City. To the FBI, he was a ghost they'd been chasing for 15 years. To business associates, he was a legitimate real estate mogul with holdings across 3 states. To his enemies, those still breathing, he was a nightmare dressed in Armani suits and wearing a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. To Elena, he was the man who'd promised her the world and delivered a prison made of gold. She remembered the beginning with painful clarity. 5 years ago, she'd been a 23-year-old graduate student at Columbia, working nights at an upscale restaurant in Tribeca to pay for her degree in art history. Victor had walked in on a Tuesday evening. She remembered because Tuesdays were always slow, and everything changed. He was older, sophisticated, commanding. When he spoke, servers moved faster. When he smiled at her, she felt seen in a way she'd never experienced. The courtship was a whirlwind. Private helicopter rides to vineyards in Napa Valley. Front row seats at Broadway shows she'd only dreamed of seeing. Jewelry that cost more than her annual tuition. He made her feel special, chosen, like she was the only woman in a city of millions. He never mentioned his real business. She never asked. Looking back, she realized that was the first compromise. The first time she chose comfort over truth. The violence started slowly. Not against her. Not at first. It was in the way people around Victor disappeared. A driver who made a mistake never showed up again. A business partner who questioned a decision was found with 2 broken legs in a Brooklyn alley. Victor never raised his voice, never showed anger. He simply made things happen and people suffered consequences. Elena learned to stay quiet. She learned that curiosity was dangerous. She learned that the penthouse, for all its beauty, was a place where questions went to die. The turning point came on a winter night 2 years into their relationship. She'd made the mistake of mentioning she wanted to visit her sister in Boston, perhaps stay for a few days. Victor had been reading the financial section of the Times, his reading glasses perched on his nose, looking every bit the respectable businessman. He didn't look up when he spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but the words carried the weight of a threat. He reminded her that her sister's husband had a construction business, how unfortunate it would be if certain city inspectors found violations, how quickly a business could crumble, how families could lose everything. He never said she couldn't go. He never had to. That night, Elena understood the true nature of her situation. She wasn't his girlfriend, she wasn't his partner. She was his possession, and the price of defiance was paid by the people she loved. So she stayed. She smiled at charity galas where Victor played the philanthropist. She wore the dresses he selected. She said nothing when she overheard late-night phone calls in Italian, when she saw blood on his shirt cuff, when strange men came to the penthouse and spoke in hushed tones about territories, shipments, and problems that needed to be eliminated. The penthouse became her world. Victor controlled who she saw, where she went, what she did. He was never overtly cruel to her. There were no bruises, no screaming fights. His control was more insidious. It was in the way he checked her phone every night, the way his driver reported her movements, the way he'd bought out the lease on her old apartment and put her belongings in storage, erasing her ability to return to her former life. He gave her everything except freedom. He loved her the way a collector loves a rare painting, something beautiful to possess, to display, to keep locked away from the world. Elena spent her days in that penthouse like a ghost haunting her own life. She'd stand at those windows for hours, watching the city move below, watching people walk freely through streets she could no longer navigate alone. She'd forgotten what it felt like to make a simple choice: what to eat, where to go, who to call. The loneliness was suffocating. She had no real friends anymore. The women in Victor's circle were wives and mistresses of other powerful men. and they all wore the same careful mask, smiling, compliant, silent about the things they'd seen. There was an unspoken understanding among them. Survival meant submission. Speaking meant dying, or worse, watching someone you loved die. At night, when Victor slept beside her, Elena would stare at the ceiling and wonder how she'd become this person. The girl who'd dreamed of curating art exhibits, who'd written her thesis on Renaissance painters, who'd believed in love and freedom and possibility. Where had she gone? When had she disappeared? The rain continued to fall outside, and Elena pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Somewhere in that vast city, there were people living ordinary lives, making ordinary decisions, free in ways she'd taken for granted until freedom was stripped away. She closed her eyes and made a silent promise to that younger version of herself, the one who'd walked into a restaurant 5 years ago with dreams intact. Somehow, someday, she would find a way out of this golden cage. She didn't know then that the opportunity would come sooner than she thought. She didn't know that Victor's empire was already beginning to crack from within, that forces beyond his control were gathering, that his power, which had seemed absolute and eternal, was about to crumble like sand through desperate fingers. All she knew in that moment was the rain, the cold glass, and the suffocating weight of a life that wasn't really hers. What happens when the cage begins to break? When the man who controlled everything starts to lose his grip on the very empire that gave him power? Elena's world is about to be shaken in ways she never imagined. If you want to discover how her story of silent survival transforms into something far more dangerous, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Chapter 2 will reveal the cracks in Victor's fortress and the dangerous choice Elena will have to make. Hit that subscribe button now, because this story is just beginning. The first sign that Victor's world was collapsing came on a Thursday morning in late March. Elena was in the penthouse library, a room lined with leather-bound books Victor had purchased by the shelf but never read, when she heard something she'd never heard before: fear in Victor Leone's voice. He was in his study, the door not quite closed, his Italian sharp and rapid. She didn't speak the language fluently, but she'd picked up enough over the years to understand fragments. Betrayal, federal investigation, seized assets, names she recognized, men who'd sat at their dinner table, who'd called Victor friend, who'd sworn loyalty with their hands over their hearts. When Victor emerged, his face was a mask of controlled fury, but Elena saw the cracks, the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched, the slight tremor in his hand as he poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon at 10 in the morning. He didn't speak to her. He never explained his business, and she'd learned years ago not to ask. But something fundamental had shifted. The air in the penthouse felt different, charged with electricity, dangerous like the moment before a storm breaks. Over the following weeks, Elena watched Victor's carefully constructed empire begin to fracture. The signs were subtle at first. Meetings that ran late into the night, voices raised in anger, phone calls that ended with Victor throwing his cell phone across the room, the disappearance of trusted associates, men who'd been part of his inner circle suddenly gone without explanation, their absences never acknowledged. The FBI had finally penetrated Victor's organization. Someone had turned informant, someone close. The federal investigation that had been circling for years had finally found its entry point, and now it was tightening like a noose around everything Victor had built. Elena learned details and fragments, piecing together the truth from overheard conversations and the tension that radiated from Victor like heat. Financial records had been seized. Shell corporations were being unraveled. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands had been frozen. Properties were under investigation. The web of legitimate businesses Victor had used to launder money for 15 years was being pulled apart thread by thread, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The mansion in Connecticut, the property Victor considered his true home, a sprawling estate with 12 bedrooms and grounds that stretched for acres, was raided in early April. Elena wasn't there, but she heard about it from Victor's remaining lawyer, a nervous man named Sal who'd started drinking heavily and jumping at sudden noises. Federal agents with warrants searching everything, taking boxes of documents, hard drives, photographs, looking for evidence, looking for proof of what everyone knew but no one could prove, that Victor Leone was the head of one of New York's most sophisticated criminal organizations. The pressure transformed Victor. The charming, controlled man Elena had known became something else. Volatile, paranoid, dangerous in new ways. He accused everyone of betrayal. His own men walked on eggshells, afraid that any mistake would be seen as disloyalty. And disloyalty in Victor's world had only one punishment. 2 of his associates were found dead in a warehouse in Red Hook. Officially, it was a drug deal gone wrong. Unofficially, everyone knew Victor had ordered it, convinced they were the informants. He was wrong. The FBI investigation continued, which meant the real informant was still out there, still feeding information to the authorities, still undetected. Elena watched all of this from her position in the shadows. For years, she'd been invisible in Victor's world, decorative, silent, controlled. But invisibility had given her a strange kind of power. She saw everything. She heard conversations men thought were private. She noticed the fear in their eyes, the way they looked at Victor now with barely concealed terror rather than respect. And she began to understand something crucial. Victor's power had never been absolute. It had been built on fear, loyalty, and money. Now the money was disappearing. The loyalty was cracking and the fear was turning inward, consuming Victor himself. The Manhattan penthouse became less of a home and more of a command center. Victor barely slept. He'd pace the marble floors at 3 a.m, his footsteps echoing through the silence, talking to himself in Italian, reviewing papers, making calls to Switzerland, to Cyprus, to offshore banks trying to move money before the feds could freeze more accounts. Elena started noticing other changes too. The building's doorman looked at her differently now. With pity, she realized. The private chef stopped coming. The housekeeper quit without explanation. Even the driver, a man named Tony, who'd been with Victor for 8 years, disappeared one Tuesday morning and never returned. They were rats fleeing a sinking ship, and Elena was still trapped on board. One night in late April, Victor came home with blood on his hands. Not a metaphor. Actual blood. He walked into the penthouse at 2 a.m, his white shirt stained, his knuckles split and raw. He went straight to the bathroom and scrubbed his hands for 20 minutes, while Elena sat on the edge of their bed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. He never explained. She never asked. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who'd lived with violence for 5 years, that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever restraint he'd maintained, whatever careful balance he'd struck between legitimate business and criminal empire was gone now. He was becoming desperate, and desperate men were the most dangerous kind. The walls were closing in from all sides. The FBI investigation was expanding. Former allies were distancing themselves or disappearing entirely. Victor's legitimate businesses were hemorrhaging money as partners pulled out and banks refused loans. The fortress he'd built was crumbling, and everyone inside it was scrambling for the exits. Everyone except Elena. She had nowhere to go. Victor had made sure of that years ago when he'd systematically cut her off from her old life. Her sister had stopped calling after that veiled threat about her husband's business. Her friends from graduate school had faded away when she kept canceling plans and became someone they no longer recognized. Her independence, financial, social, emotional, had been eroded so gradually she hadn't noticed until it was completely gone. But something was changing inside her too. As Victor's empire collapsed, as his power diminished, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The cage was breaking. The man who'd controlled every aspect of her existence was losing control of his own world. For the first time since she'd met him, Victor Leone was vulnerable. Late one night, unable to sleep while Victor paced in his study, Elena stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan and realized something profound. She'd spent 5 years afraid of what Victor would do if she tried to leave. But she'd never considered what she might do if his power disappeared entirely. What if the monster that kept her trapped simply ceased to exist? The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Freedom had become so foreign to her that imagining it felt like trying to remember a language she'd once spoken fluently, but had forgotten over years of disuse. The rain started again that night, drops racing down the glass like tears. Elena pressed her palm against the window and made a decision. She didn't know how or when, but she knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't go down with Victor's sinking ship. When the opportunity came, and it would come, because collapsing empires always created chaos and chaos created openings, she would take it. She would find a way out of the golden cage even if she had to break the bars herself. The empire is crumbling, but Elena's greatest test is still ahead. When everything Victor built comes crashing down, she'll face a choice that will define the rest of her life. Will she remain a prisoner to her fear, Or will she seize the one chance she has at freedom? Chapter 3 reveals the confrontation that changes everything, a moment 5 years in the making. Don't miss it. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of Elena's journey from captivity to liberation. May arrived in New York with unseasonable heat, the kind that made the city shimmer and turned the penthouse into a pressure cooker. Despite the air conditioning running constantly, Elena could feel something building, a tension so thick it was almost visible. Like watching thunderclouds gather on a summer afternoon when you know the storm is coming, but not exactly when it will break. Victor had become a ghost of himself. The man who'd once commanded rooms with a look, who'd built an empire through cunning and ruthlessness, now looked haunted. He'd lost weight. His expensive suits hung differently on his frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and he'd developed a habit of looking over his shoulder, even in his own home. The Connecticut mansion, his pride, his fortress, sat empty now, marked by federal seizure notices and surrounded by evidence tape. Lawyers' bills were piling up faster than even Victor's remaining resources could handle. 3 of his front companies had declared bankruptcy. 2 more were under federal investigation. The legitimate facade he'd maintained for 15 years was in ruins, and behind it, the criminal empire was exposed like a wound. But it was the betrayals that truly destroyed him. One by one, Victor's trusted associates were cutting deals with federal prosecutors. Men who'd sworn blood oaths were trading testimony for reduced sentences. The organization he'd built on loyalty and fear was cannibalizing itself, everyone scrambling to save themselves as the ship went down. Elena heard the names sometimes when Victor raged into his phone. Angelo, who'd been Victor's accountant for 12 years. Marcus, his head of security. Even Salvatore, his oldest friend from Brooklyn, the man who'd been best man at Victor's first wedding. All of them had turned. All of them were talking. The FBI didn't need just one informant anymore. They had a chorus. The Manhattan penthouse, once a symbol of Victor's success, had become his last stronghold. But it was shrinking too. The building management had received court orders. Assets were being identified and tagged for seizure. Soon even this glass tower overlooking the city would be taken away. Elena knew the end was coming. She could feel it in the way Victor looked at her now, not with possessive control, but with something desperate and needy. She was all he had left. Everyone else had betrayed him, disappeared, or been arrested. In his mind, only Elena remained loyal. She wasn't loyal. She was trapped. But Victor, in his desperation, couldn't see the difference anymore. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in mid-May. Elena was in the kitchen preparing tea, one of the few domestic tasks she'd maintained because it gave her something to do with her hands, something that felt almost normal, when she heard Victor's voice rise to a level she'd never heard before. He was screaming at someone on the phone, his Italian rapid and venomous. Then there was a crash, his phone hitting the wall, shattering. Silence. Then footsteps, heavy and purposeful, coming toward the kitchen. Elena's hands froze on the kettle. Her entire body tensed with an instinct older than thought, the primal recognition that a predator was approaching. She turned slowly. Victor stood in the doorway, and for the first time in 5 years, Elena saw him as he truly was. Not a powerful crime boss, not a sophisticated businessman, but a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable. His eyes were wild, his breathing was ragged, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He told her they were leaving. Tonight. He'd arranged transport to Montreal, then on to a country with no extradition treaty. He'd been moving money, making plans. They'd disappear, start over, leave everything behind. Elena's mind raced. This was it. The moment she'd been waiting for and dreading. An opportunity and a trap in equal measure. She could go with him, remain his prisoner in some foreign country where she'd be even more isolated, even more dependent. Or she could refuse and face whatever consequences Victor's desperation might bring. She looked at him standing in that doorway, this man who'd stolen 5 years of her life, and something inside her cracked open, not with fear, but with clarity. Sudden, brilliant, liberating clarity. She spoke, and her voice was steady in a way it hadn't been in years. She said no. The word hung in the air between them, small but absolute. No. She wouldn't go. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, hiding, pretending, living in fear of whatever country they fled to, whatever new cage Victor would build around her. Victor stared at her, as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. In his world, In his experience, people didn't refuse him. They couldn't. He moved toward her, his voice dropping to that dangerous softness he used when he wanted to remind people of consequences, when he wanted to threaten without speaking threats. He reminded her of her sister, her brother-in-law's business, how easily things could happen to people, how accidents occurred, how loyalty mattered more than anything, and betrayal was the ultimate sin. Elena listened to the words she'd heard variations of for 5 years, the threats that had kept her compliant, silent, trapped. But something had changed. Maybe it was watching his empire crumble. Maybe it was realizing that his power had always been an illusion, sustained by her belief in it. Maybe it was simply that she'd spent so long being afraid that she'd exhausted her capacity for fear. She took a step toward him instead of away. She looked directly into his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that had once made her feel special and seen, before she understood that his gaze was that of an owner admiring property. And she spoke the words that would change everything. She told him she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of his threats, not of what he might do, because she understood something he'd never grasped. True power wasn't about control or fear or violence. It was about choosing yourself, even when the choice was terrifying, especially when the choice was terrifying. She explained, her voice growing stronger with each word, that she'd rather face whatever consequences came from leaving him than spend one more day in the golden cage he'd built. She'd rather risk her sister's safety, knowing her brother-in-law was tough and capable and would protect his family, than sacrifice her own soul to Victor's paranoia. She'd rather live with uncertainty and danger than die slowly in luxury and captivity. She told him that his empire was gone. His power was an echo. His threats were empty because he had nothing left, no organization, no money, no allies. Just desperation and rage, and those things might make him dangerous, but they didn't make him powerful. And then she said something that cut deeper than any insult, any accusation. She told him she pitied him, because he'd built his entire identity on domination and control, and now that those things were stripped away, he was nothing. Just a frightened man facing consequences he'd spent 15 years running from. The words hung between them in the kitchen, with the kettle still steaming and the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows. Elena could see the impact on Victor's face. Shock, rage, disbelief, and underneath it all, the terrible recognition that she was right. He raised his hand, and for a moment Elena thought he might actually hit her, might cross that final line he'd never crossed before. But even in his desperation, some part of Victor understood that physical violence against her wouldn't change anything. The control was broken. The spell was shattered. She'd spoken the truth into existence, and truth once spoken couldn't be taken back. His hand dropped. His face transformed from rage to something that looked almost like grief. Because in that moment, Victor lost the last thing he'd thought he possessed, Elena's fear. He stepped back, turned, walked out of the kitchen without another word. Elena heard his study door slam, then silence. She stood alone in that kitchen, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with adrenaline, and realized she'd just freed herself, not by running, not by escaping, but by simply refusing to be afraid, by choosing herself over safety, by speaking truth to the man who'd tried to own her. The golden cage had no lock. It never had. She just needed to see that the door was always open, that the only thing keeping her inside was her own fear. And now, that fear was gone. Elena has spoken the words that shattered her prison, but her journey isn't over. Victor may be broken, but desperate men are unpredictable. The final confrontation, the moment that will determine whether Elena truly escapes or remains trapped forever, is coming in Chapter 4. This is where 5 years of silence, fear, and captivity finally resolve into freedom or tragedy. You need to see how this story ends. Subscribe now so you're here for the final chapter, the moment that defines everything. The hours after Elena's declaration moved with the strange, suspended quality of a dream. She'd spoken words that couldn't be unspoken, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The penthouse felt different now, less like a prison and more like a stage where the final act was about to play out. Victor remained in his study for the rest of the evening. Elena could hear him in there, the sound of drawers opening and closing, papers shuffling, the occasional crash as something was thrown or knocked over. She didn't know if he was destroying evidence, packing to flee alone, or simply unraveling. She didn't go to check. For the first time in 5 years, what Victor Leone was doing wasn't her concern. She sat in the living room as darkness fell over Manhattan, the city lights spreading out below like a constellation of possibility. Her phone, the one Victor had given her, the one he monitored and controlled, sat on the glass coffee table. She'd never made a call or sent a message without his approval. Now she picked it up and, hands trembling slightly, dialed the number she'd memorized years ago but never had the courage to use. Her sister answered on the third ring. There was a moment of stunned silence when Lisa heard Elena's voice, then questions tumbling over each other. "Are you okay? Where are you? What's happened? Why haven't you called?" Elena's throat tightened with 5 years of suppressed emotion. She explained in fragments that she was leaving Victor, that she needed help, that she knew she'd been absent and distant and a terrible sister, but she was ready now, ready to reclaim her life, ready to face whatever came next. Lisa's response was immediate and fierce. She was coming to New York. Tonight. She and her husband would drive down from Boston and be there by midnight. Elena just needed to hold on, stay safe, and wait. Help was coming. When Elena ended the call, she felt something break open in her chest. Relief so profound it was almost painful. She wasn't alone. She thought she was, thought she'd burned every bridge. But family was still there, had always been there. She'd just been too afraid to reach out. Around 11 p.m., Victor emerged from his study. He looked like he'd aged a decade in those few hours. His face was gray, his movements slow and defeated. When he saw Elena sitting in the living room, he stopped. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Victor's expression was complex. Anger, loss, something that might have been regret. Elena met his gaze steadily, no longer flinching, no longer looking away. He told her he was leaving. He'd arranged transport and would be gone within the hour. He didn't ask her to come with him again. He knew the answer. Then he said something Elena never expected. He told her he was sorry. Not for everything. Victor Leone wasn't capable of that kind of comprehensive remorse. But sorry that he'd loved her the only way he knew how, which was through possession rather than partnership. He genuinely believed he was giving her the world, never understanding that the world meant nothing without freedom. It wasn't enough. It didn't excuse 5 years of control, manipulation, and fear. But it was something, an acknowledgement that maybe, in his own twisted way, he'd thought he was doing right by her. Elena didn't forgive him. She might never forgive him. But she understood, finally, that Victor was as trapped by his nature as she'd been trapped by his control. She told him to leave, to disappear, run, do whatever he needed to do. But to never contact her again, never threaten her family, never enter her life again in any capacity. This was the end of them, final and absolute. Victor nodded slowly. Then he did something that surprised her one last time. He walked to his study, returned with a thick envelope and placed it on the coffee table. Inside, he said, was enough cash to start over. Money he'd kept hidden, untraceable. Not a gift. A debt paid. For the 5 years she'd given him, for the life she'd lost, for the silence she'd maintained even when speaking could have destroyed him. Then he walked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle, and looked back one final time. His last words to her were quiet, almost inaudible. He hoped she found what she was looking for. Hoped she built a life that was truly hers. Hoped she understood that some men were too broken to love properly. But that didn't mean the love wasn't real. Then he was gone, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the penthouse. Elena sat in the silence, processing what had just happened. The envelope sat on the table, tangible proof that this was real, that she was truly free. She opened it. Bundles of $100 bills, easily $50,000 or more. Enough to rent an apartment, start fresh, bridge the gap between captivity and independence. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt empty, hollowed out. 5 years of her life compressed into a single night. A handful of conversations. An envelope of cash. Was that all it amounted to? Was freedom really this quiet? This undramatic? Lisa arrived just after midnight with her husband Tom. They burst into the penthouse full of energy and concern, ready to rescue her. To fight whatever battles needed fighting. But there was nothing to fight. Victor was gone. The danger had passed. Elena just needed to leave, to walk out of this place and never look back. They helped her pack a single suitcase. Clothes, documents, a few personal items. Everything else. The designer dresses, the jewelry, the expensive art. belonged to the life she was leaving behind. She took only what was hers, what she'd need to rebuild. As they prepared to leave, Elena took one last walk through the penthouse. She stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows, where she'd spent countless hours watching the city below, trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but was suffocating within. The rain had started again, drops racing down the glass, and she remembered all those nights of silent desperation. But she wasn't desperate anymore. She was free, genuinely, completely free. They left just before 1 a.m., taking the elevator down 40 floors while Elena's heart raced with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. What if Victor changed his mind? What if he was waiting in the lobby? What if this was all a trap? But the lobby was empty except for a night doorman who barely glanced up. They walked out onto the Manhattan street, the humid night air wrapping around Elena like an embrace. Tom's car was parked at the curb, and Lisa opened the back door, guiding Elena inside like she was something precious and fragile. As they pulled away from the building, Elena turned to look back one last time. The penthouse was dark now, a black square in a tower of lights. Her prison, her cage, her entire world for 5 years. Now just a building among millions in a city full of other people's stories. Lisa reached back from the front seat and squeezed Elena's hand, asked if she was okay, if she needed anything, where she wanted to go. Elena looked at her sister, at this person who'd driven 4 hours in the middle of the night without hesitation, who'd never given up on her even when she'd disappeared into Victor's world, and felt tears finally come. Not sad tears, but the kind that come with release, with the end of something terrible and the beginning of something unknown but full of possibility. She told Lisa she wanted to go home, not to any specific place because she didn't have one anymore, but home in the sense of safety, family, a life that was truly hers to shape. For the first time in 5 years, she wanted to make choices, small ones like what to eat for breakfast and big ones like what to do with the rest of her life. As they drove through the empty Manhattan streets toward the highway, Elena watched the city slide past her window. Somewhere out there, Victor was running, trying to escape the consequences that had finally caught up to him. The FBI would find him eventually, or he'd disappear into whatever foreign country offered him refuge. Either way, he was no longer her problem, no longer her responsibility, no longer the central figure in her universe. The rain fell harder as they crossed the bridge out of Manhattan. Elena leaned her head against the car window, exhausted but awake, empty, but somehow full. She thought about the girl she'd been 5 years ago, idealistic, naive, vulnerable to the kind of charm and attention Victor had weaponized. That girl was gone. She'd been killed slowly over 5 years of captivity, compromised away piece by piece until nothing remained. But maybe that wasn't entirely true. Maybe some core of that girl still existed, buried deep beneath the survival mechanisms and the learned silence. Maybe, given time and space and freedom, Elena could excavate that core and build something new around it. Not who she'd been, but who she might become. The final piece of Elena's transformation came 3 months later. She was living with Lisa and Tom in Boston, working part-time at a small art gallery while she figured out her next steps. Victor had been arrested in Montreal trying to board a flight to Dubai. The news showed him in handcuffs, looking diminished and old. Nothing like the powerful figure who'd once controlled her life. Federal prosecutors were building a case that would likely keep him in prison for decades. Elena felt nothing when she saw the footage. No satisfaction, no vindication, no residual fear. Just a distant recognition that this was a person she used to know, someone from a life that felt increasingly like it had happened to someone else. The gallery owner, a woman named Margaret who'd hired Elena despite the gaps in her resume and her lack of recent references, asked her one afternoon to write a statement about a new exhibit they were featuring. It was about resilience, about women's stories, about transformation and survival. Elena sat at the small desk in the gallery's back office, staring at the blank page, and found herself writing something entirely different than what Margaret had requested. She wrote about golden cages and the illusion of power, about fear and silence, and the slow erosion of self, about the moment when you finally look at the thing that's been controlling you and realize it only has power, because you've been giving it power, believing in its strength, while forgetting your own. She wrote about facing a mafia boss in the ruins of his empire and saying 5 words that changed everything. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Margaret read it, tears in her eyes, and asked if she could include it in the exhibit. Elena agreed, but only anonymously. This wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about testimony, about bearing witness to her own survival, about leaving a record that the girl in the golden cage had escaped and become someone new. The exhibit opened on a Thursday evening in September. Elena stood in the gallery, surrounded by artwork about transformation, listening to strangers read her words aloud, and felt something settle in her chest. Peace, maybe, or acceptance, or simply the knowledge that she'd survived something terrible and come out the other side fundamentally changed but essentially intact. That night, walking back to Lisa's house through Boston Street still warm from summer's residual heat, Elena realized the story wasn't about Victor. It never had been. It was about her, about the journey from captivity to freedom, about learning that the strongest prisons are the ones we build in our own minds, about discovering that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward, despite fear's weight. She'd looked a Mafia boss in the eyes and told him she wasn't afraid anymore. But the person she'd really been speaking to, the person who really needed to hear those words, was herself. And in speaking them, she'd become free. The rain started again that September night, but Elena didn't run for cover. She walked through it, face tilted up to the sky, letting the water wash over her like baptism, like rebirth, like the first rain after a long drought. The city smelled clean, the air felt new, and for the first time in 5 years, Elena Marino wasn't afraid of getting wet, of losing control, of what might happen next. She was simply alive and free and ready to write the next chapter of a story that belonged only to her. Tentar novamente, continue our epilogue. 2 years later, the art gallery in Brooklyn's Dumbo district wasn't large, but it had high ceilings and natural light that poured through industrial windows, illuminating the hardwood floors with golden afternoon sun. Elena stood near the entrance, adjusting the placement card next to a striking photograph. A bird escaping from a gilded cage, wings spread mid-flight against a stormy sky. It was the opening night of her first solo exhibit as a curator. The theme, breaking free, stories of survival and transformation. She'd spent 18 months planning it, reaching out to artists whose work explored trauma, resilience, and the journey from captivity to liberation. Not just physical captivity, though there were pieces about that too, but the emotional, psychological, and spiritual cages people built or had built around them. The gallery was beginning to fill. Margaret had driven down from Boston, bringing Lisa and Tom with her. Elena's former professor from Columbia had come, tears in her eyes when she saw what her once promising student had become. There were journalists, art critics, collectors, and ordinary people who'd seen the publicity and felt drawn to the theme. Elena wore a simple black dress, elegant but not ostentatious, professional but not performative. Her hair, which she'd kept long because Victor had preferred it that way, was now cut to her shoulders in a practical, freeing style. She wore minimal jewelry, just small silver earrings her sister had given her last Christmas. Everything about her presentation said, "This is who I am, on my own terms." A woman approached her, mid-50s, well-dressed, with eyes that looked like they'd seen difficult things and survived them. She asked Elena about one of the pieces, a painting of a woman standing in a doorway, 1 foot inside a dark room, 1 foot in bright sunlight, her face turned toward the light. Elena explained the artist's vision, the moment of choice, the threshold between what was and what could be, the courage required to step from familiar darkness into uncertain light. The woman listened, nodding, then said quietly that she understood that threshold, had stood on it herself once, knew exactly how much strength it took to move forward. They talked for 20 minutes, two strangers connected by the universal language of survival. When the woman finally moved on to view other pieces, she squeezed Elena's hand and whispered, "Thank you, not for the art, but for creating a space where stories like theirs could be seen, acknowledged, validated." This happened 3 more times that evening. Different people, different stories, same essential truth. Everyone carried some version of captivity within them. Fear, trauma, shame, relationships that had become prisons, jobs that suffocated, expectations that crushed. The specifics varied, but the core experience was universal, being trapped and finding the courage to break free. As the evening progressed, Elena found herself in conversation with a journalist from a national magazine. The woman wanted to do a feature on the exhibit, on Elena's journey from Columbia grad student to Her words were tactful but clear, someone who disappeared for 5 years and re-emerged as a rising voice in the art world. Elena had learned to handle these conversations. She didn't hide her past entirely, but she didn't sensationalize it either. She spoke in generalities about being in a controlling relationship, about losing herself, about the process of reclamation. She never mentioned Victor's name, never discussed the specifics of his criminal empire. That story belonged to prosecutors and journalists who covered organized crime. Her story was about something more fundamental, the human capacity to survive, adapt, and ultimately transform. The journalist asked the question they always asked: how did you find the courage to leave? Elena's answer had evolved over 2 years. At first, she'd struggled to articulate it. Now she understood. Courage hadn't been a sudden revelation or a moment of dramatic defiance. It had been accumulated in small increments. Each time she'd questioned the situation instead of accepting it. Each time she'd remembered who she'd been before. Each time she'd imagined a different future. Courage was built like muscle memory, through repeated small acts of resistance until the day came when she'd finally had enough strength to use it. But there was also this. Watching Victor's power collapse had shown her that the thing she'd feared most wasn't invincible. His control had only ever been as strong as her belief in it. Once that belief cracked, everything else followed. Near the end of the evening, as guests were beginning to leave and Elena was feeling the pleasant exhaustion of a successful opening, a man approached her. Late 30s, federal agent written all over him in his conservative suit and observant eyes. He introduced himself as Agent David Chen, FBI. Elena's heart jumped, old instincts triggering anxiety. But Agent Chen's expression was kind, his manner respectful. He wasn't there to question her or investigate her. He wanted her to know that Victor Leone had been sentenced that afternoon. 23 years in federal prison. With his age and health declining, it was essentially a life sentence. Elena processed this information standing in her gallery, surrounded by art about survival and transformation, and felt a curious absence of emotion. She'd thought she might feel relief or vindication or closure. Instead, she felt only a distant acknowledgement. That chapter was truly closed now. Victor Leone would spend the rest of his life in a cage, a real one with bars and guards and no possibility of parole. There was a certain symmetry in that. Agent Chen said something else then, something that surprised her. He told her that her testimony, the statement she'd given to federal prosecutors about her 5 years with Victor, had been more valuable than she probably realized. Not because it had provided evidence for specific crimes, but because it had painted a picture of who Victor Leone actually was. The control, the manipulation, the systematic isolation. That testimony had helped the prosecution counter Victor's lawyers' attempts to present him as a legitimate businessman, caught up in unfortunate associations. Her voice, in other words, had mattered. Her truth had contributed to justice. After Agent Chen left, Elena stood alone in the center of her gallery, surrounded by art that told stories of breaking free, and allowed herself to feel what she'd been holding back all evening. Pride. Not the arrogant kind, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd survived something terrible and then built something meaningful from the wreckage. She'd taken her trauma and transformed it into purpose. She'd used her experience to create space for other people's stories. She'd refused to let the worst 5 years of her life define her, but she hadn't pretended they didn't happen either. She'd integrated them, learned from them, and emerged as someone stronger and more empathetic than the naive girl who'd walked into a Tribeca restaurant 7 years ago. Margaret approached, putting an arm around Elena's shoulders. She commented on how well the opening had gone, how moved people had been, how this was just the beginning of what was clearly going to be a brilliant career. But then Margaret said something more personal. She was proud of Elena, not just professionally, but as one human being witnessing another human being's journey. She'd seen Elena arrive in Boston 2 years ago, traumatized, uncertain, fragile in ways that weren't immediately visible. She'd watched her slowly piece herself back together, relearn how to make decisions, rediscover her own voice and vision. This gallery, this exhibit, this entire evening, it wasn't just professional success. It was proof of reclamation, evidence that captivity, no matter how complete it seemed, was never permanent unless you allowed it to be. Elena hugged Margaret, tears she'd been holding back finally coming. They were good tears this time, the kind that came with genuine happiness, with achievement earned through struggle. with the recognition that she'd not only survived, but thrived. After everyone had left and the gallery was locked up, Elena walked through Brooklyn streets toward the small apartment she'd rented 6 months earlier. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom in a building without a doorman, with creaky floors and questionable plumbing, but it was entirely hers. She'd chosen it. She paid for it with money she earned. The locks answered only to her keys. The city felt different now than it had 2 years ago when she'd fled the Manhattan penthouse. Then, New York had felt like a trap. Every street a reminder of her captivity. Now it felt like possibility. She could go anywhere, do anything, be anyone. The cage was broken and she'd learned to trust her own wings. That night, sitting in her small apartment with a cup of tea, Elena opened her laptop and began writing. Not for an exhibit or a statement or anyone else's eyes, just for herself. She wrote about the journey, all of it. The girl who'd believed charm and luxury meant love. The years of slow suffocation. The moment of clarity when she'd finally said no. The aftermath, which had been harder than she'd expected because freedom came with its own challenges and responsibilities. She wrote about rebuilding an identity that had been systematically dismantled, about relearning how to trust her own judgment, about the therapy sessions where she'd unpacked years of trauma, about the relationships she'd tentatively begun forming, friendships first and recently cautiously, the possibility of something romantic with a kind architect named Daniel, who didn't ask too many questions about her past and seemed content to know her in the present. She wrote about forgiveness, not of Victor. She still wasn't sure that was possible or even necessary, but of herself, for staying as long as she had, for not seeing the red flags sooner, for all the compromises and silences and erasures she'd accepted in exchange for false security. She wrote about understanding that survival sometimes meant making choices that didn't look brave from the outside, that looked like weakness or compliance, but were actually sophisticated strategies for staying alive until the moment came when escape became possible. She wrote about the difference between the dramatic moment of breaking free, that night when she'd confronted Victor, and the quieter, harder work of staying free, of building a life, of maintaining boundaries, of choosing herself again and again in small daily decisions that accumulated into a completely new existence. When she finally stopped writing, dawn was breaking over Brooklyn. Elena saved the document, closed her laptop, and walked to her apartment window. The view wasn't impressive, just other buildings, a slice of street, ordinary Brooklyn morning coming to life. But it was her view, from her window, in her life. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 years ago, eager, naive, hungry for experiences she hadn't yet learned could devour you. That woman was gone, killed by experience and reborn as someone entirely different. Someone who understood that love should free you, not imprison you. That real power came from self-determination, not domination. That the strongest person in any room was the one who knew their own worth and couldn't be convinced otherwise. Elena made herself breakfast, scrambled eggs, coffee, toast with butter, and ate it slowly, savoring the simple pleasure of making her own choices. What to eat, when to eat, how to spend her Sunday morning. Luxuries she'd once taken for granted, then lost, then fought to reclaim. Her phone buzzed with messages from the previous evening. Margaret, sharing reviews that were already appearing online, all glowing, all praising the exhibit's emotional depth and curatorial vision. Lisa, sending photos from the opening, Elena caught mid-conversation looking confident and professional and genuinely happy. Daniel asking if she wanted to meet for lunch, no pressure, just checking in. Elena responded to each message, these threads connecting her to a life that was messy and imperfect, but authentically hers. Then she opened her calendar and looked at the week ahead. Meetings with artists, follow-ups from the opening, a therapy appointment on Wednesday, dinner with Lisa on Friday, small commitments and large ones, building blocks of a life reconstructed from ruins. 2 years ago, she'd walked out of a penthouse prison with nothing but a suitcase and an envelope of cash. Now she had this, a career she was building, relationships she was nurturing, an identity she was continuously defining on her own terms. It wasn't perfect. Some days were harder than others. The trauma hadn't disappeared entirely. It probably never would, but she'd learned to carry it without letting it carry her. She'd looked a Mafia boss in the eyes and said she wasn't afraid anymore. And she'd meant it. Not just about him, but about life itself. About taking risks, making mistakes, being vulnerable, trying again after failure. Fear would always exist, it was part of being human, but it no longer controlled her. It no longer defined the boundaries of what was possible. Elena Marino was free, genuinely, completely, irrevocably free, and that freedom, earned through courage and maintained through constant choice, was the most valuable thing she'd ever possessed. The morning sun climbed higher over Brooklyn, and Elena finished her coffee, washed her dishes, and got ready to face another day, not as someone's possession, not as a prisoner in a golden cage, but as herself, flawed, strong, free, and still becoming whoever she chose to be next. The story that had begun with captivity ended with liberation, and the story that began with liberation, that was just beginning, and its ending hadn't been written yet, because that's what freedom meant. The power to write your own story, one choice at a time for the rest of your life. And that's where we leave Elena. Not at the end of her story, but at the beginning of the one that truly matters. The one where she's free. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even the strongest cages can be broken, that courage can be built one small act at a time, that it's never too late to reclaim your life, then please subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week. Stories about survival, transformation, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there, someone is standing in their own golden cage, wondering if freedom is possible, and your share might be exactly what they need to take that first step. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Elena's story. And remember, you're stronger than you think, braver than you believe, and you deserve a life that's truly yours. Until next time, keep breaking free.